Hey, I'm Jay Leeming, and I'm here with Bethany Dixon, and we are talking about the Odyssey. Bethany is a woman of many talents. She's a poet, a musician, and a baker as well. Thanks for being here, Bethany.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
You're welcome. And where the heck are we? Maybe people want to know. Well, we're on my back porch. There's wind, there's sun. It is, well, some of the last days of August here. And I thought if it's okay with you, Bethany, I would just start by briefly bringing the story into the room, just so we're there talking about it.
That sounds great.
With it.
We made it to Ithaca already, so we're in the right place.
Oh yeah, we're safe. We're home.
Safe.
We're home in Ithaca. Yeah. Absolutely. Wow. So yeah, I just thought I'd bring it up so we know what we're thinking about here, what we're dreaming about here. So we remember Ithaca, this Ithaca and the other Ithaca. We remember Penelope and Telemachus on that island. Telemachus growing up on that island, raised by his mother, near the whispering sound of the sea. We remember Odysseus. We remember the Trojan War, that great conflict that claimed so many lives. We remember his journey home. We remember the island of the Ciconians, or in fact the town of the Ciconians, which he sacked on the way home. We remember the island of the lotus eaters, who eat that flower that makes them forget everything they knew about wanting to go home. We remember the island of the Cyclops, where Odysseus was no one for a time, and then was someone, and in his boasting he brought disaster upon himself. We remember the island of the Lastrygonians, who destroyed all the ships in his fleet but his own. We remember the island of Aeolus, the king of the winds, and how his sailors opened the bag and sent them whirling back to where they'd come from. We remember the island of Cersei, the lady of the beasts, and how they stayed there for an entire year, and how on that island Odysseus learned many things. We remember the sirens, singing the music that we must not hear. We remember Scylla and Charybdis, the island of the sun god Thrinacia, where his sailors ate the cattle of the sun god, and everyone was killed except for Odysseus. We remember how, helped by the Phaeacians, he made his way home, in rags as a beggar, and found his way back to his own home, and routed the suitors from that place. And how finally he and Penelope were reunited on the island of Ithaca.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
You're welcome. Well, a story's like an animal some ways, and you want it to come be here with us, and can all get so technical if we're just talking about it,
I think invitations are always good.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
And invocations, right?
Yes. And perhaps it can be here with us in this way, this story. How'd you run into this story for the first time?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I read some of it in high school, but it had a very sort of cobwebby feeling to it, and I think it never hooked me in any way until I think 3 years ago was when I first started working on what I'm currently working on, which is a collection of poems centered around reclaiming female narratives from the Odyssey. And the way I came across that was I was going through a time in my life where a lot of the women that I knew and loved, including myself, were sort of wrestling with a lot of different types of grief and trauma and, things that I think all of us have experienced recently, but a lot of intergenerational, just heavy things. And so a friend of mine recommended the book Cersei by Madeline Miller. And I listened to the audiobook of that, actually, speaking of telling stories, and it was so beautiful and such a nuanced portrait of this character in the Odyssey who I'd never really thought much about, because in the Odyssey itself, she doesn't have that much space on the page. And it just made me start thinking about all the characters that live inside this particular story and the sort of richness that lies in the act of co-creating with the myth and sort of going back and I work in a library, and I love finding little rabbit holes of research to hook onto and fall into. And so that was my gateway into the Odyssey. And then I started reading Emily Wilson's translation of it, which is so beautiful and really nimble and sort of fluid. And it read like I understood why this story would be sung and told and remembered. And then I just kept having all these sort of interesting serendipitous connections to the Odyssey. Like I met Athena Kirk, who we were speaking of earlier, who's an amazing ancient Greek professor, and I met a few musicians who were working on projects around the Odyssey. And this is just a very small, funny story, but my great uncle he passed away last year, but he was an archaeology professor at Harvard and also very into classics. And a few years back, I was up in a tiny town in Maine where my family's from, and my aunt, his daughter, was there, and I was telling her about this poetry project. And she's this little Sicilian woman, and she was wearing sort of a big fisherman's cardigan, and she reached into her pocket and said, "I have something for you," and pulled out 3 ancient Greek coins and said, "Oh, these were Dad's. I don't know why I'm carrying them around, but I think they're meant for you."
Oh, wow.
And so it's just been a really fun and sort of magical project. And I think, like a lot of projects, sometimes I set it aside and come back to it, but I guess the Odyssey is all about leaving and returning anyway, so it just feels like something that I would happily spend my life investigating and creating with.
Yeah, wonderful. It's amazing when the stories kind of enter our lives, or we enter the story.
I agree.
And
yes.
It sounds like that's happened to you with this story.
It feels like that. And I read a quote once, a Carl Jung quote, who I know, had his complications like all famous figures. But this quote says that archetypes are like a dry riverbed. And when you step into the riverbed, it fills up and the archetypes carry you along on this current. And I love that phrase because that is what it feels like. It sort of feels the way I think it feels to play a piece of music that was composed by someone a long time ago. It's sort of like as a poet, you're able to step into this conversation that's been going on for centuries with every poet who's ever stepped into this story. The story itself, the etymology, everything. And so it just feels, I think all of the creative pursuits I have are very solitary, which I love, but it's also really beautiful to sort of co-create even in solitude.
Yeah. Well, as a poet, in some ways, especially these days, you get to write whatever you want, right?
Right.
Nothing's off the table. But then when you're in service to a story, suddenly you get to... it's very freeing, I find, as a storyteller, and sometimes as a poet in my practice as well. Suddenly it's not all about you,
I
and you
agree.
have this other level, which is archetypal and goes way back to
Absolutely.
the underground of all of us, Yeah, that's cool. Certainly as a storyteller, like I can tell the story because I've lived parts of it,
Right.
Like parts of it feel resonant, like, oh wow,
Exactly. Right.
I had this experience and that was like that.
But like you say, it's also, you have this other context for the experience. So in some ways it's easier to look at your own experience through the lens of archetype sometimes too. I think the resonance can be a double-edged sword, and sometimes it's useful to have this other frame of reference and to know that these things are truly universal. I mean, they're
Yes.
archetypal to the core.
Right. It makes people less lonely, I think.
I agree.
Like, wow, I'm not the only person who's experienced this,
Right.
And it's interesting, you said that grief and sorrow was your way into the Odyssey.
Yeah, I think this sort of reckoning with pretty, in some ways, not unique, sadly, but I think pretty severe sort of familial or some sexual abuse things, depression, just things that are also woven through the day-to-day life of so many people. But I think it was just an especially intense time of a lot of people I loved sort of reckoning with their, I don't know what to call them, not demons, but the weight at the same time. And so it felt very supportive and sort of imperative to be able to draw on this archetypal theme of women who had all these similar experiences and all this sort of wisdom and grief and humor. I mean, I think I love the strangeness of the characters in the Odyssey as well, and no one feels one-dimensional to me. None of the women. I think they don't come across as having a lack of agency. I just think that the time spent on them is small enough that it sort of gives, or I'm taking creative license to go back and kind of tell my own myth based on the breadcrumb trail of clues about who the characters might be that I've gathered.
Yeah. And what are some of the female characters that drew you in at first?
Well, I mean, certainly the main characters were on my list. I think the first one that really drew me in was Cersei because of the Madeline Miller book. But then Calypso followed pretty closely, and one thing that I often do for characters like Penelope or Athena, I think there's, and even Cersei, there's a lot more about them, just sort of in the common knowledge. Like I would have known a little bit about Penelope even if I had never opened the Odyssey.
Yeah.
But for Calypso, for example, in the Odyssey, she's portrayed as this sort of enchantress. She's a weaver as well. She's a musician as well. I really love how her home is described as this sort of lush musical place full of like golden threads and fir trees and violets, and
it sounds great.
It sounds great.
Yeah, it sounds, yeah.
And I was fascinated by the tension between, was Odysseus there as a captive? Was he a willing captive? I mean, he was probably having a pretty okay time in this beautiful bower.
Right.
But I was really interested in I'm curious about this character. What hooks can I find to sort of see her as a more multi-dimensional character? So I started researching the mythology giant family tree, which is, astoundingly huge, even without 23andMe.
Right.
One thing I found was that Calypso's sisters were the Pleiades, and her father was Atlas. And so those two things, and I do have this deep love of sort of psychology and curiosity about, emotions and behavior and all those things. So I started researching that a little more, and I found out the story of the Pleiades and how they became the Pleiades, which I had never known. And you probably know it, but I had never encountered it. And the story of the origin of the constellation is that these 7 sisters were being chased on Earth by Orion, the hunter. And they were chased for 7 years. And they were like, this is ridiculous. Zeus, please do something. And Zeus, being Zeus, was like, okay, I'll help, sort of. And so he turns them into the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, in the sky. But then he turns Orion into a constellation who is still chasing them across the sky. And so I was just like, God, Zeus, you're such a jerk. So,
right, they're being chased forever.
They're being chased forever.
Yeah.
And so I both loved and hated that. But that's what I mean. I love the sort of strange humor woven into these stories. And then I started thinking about what it would mean for a woman like Calypso to have a father who was, burdened with holding up the whole earth. And I think, again, going back to the grief, my father, who passed away 6 years ago, we were never we never really managed to have a close relationship, and a lot of that was because of this immense weight of his depression and his grief and his inability to really have the tools to deal with that himself, which I think is, very common, especially with older generations. And so I was also in the process of really finding a lot of ways to retroactively try to repair that relationship even after his death. And there's a line from a poem I love that says, "Mourning is a romance in reverse." And I was just thinking a lot about that, sort of what reparations can be done even after someone has left your life, and getting a lot of comfort and sort of inspiration from that. So I started imagining Calypso with this father who is constantly weighed down, and thinking also about this line from an Anne Carson poem, and please tell me if I'm rambling too much about poems.
No.
There's a line from Anne Carson's piece called The Glass Essay, and it says, "You remember too much, my mother said to me recently. Why hold on to all that? And I said, where can I put it down?" And so I kept thinking about that question, where can I put it down? And if you imagine a small child with a father holding the world, he can't, there's nowhere for him to put it down. And so I started thinking about Calypso on this beautiful island that she's sort of woven into existence, and coming across Odysseus, who also is a man who is severely burdened by sort of his own mythology, his own world, and just thinking about what that might mean to her, to him. And I didn't really try to parse that apart in the poem so much, but I wanted to give her the framework, because it's such a rich framework just from the history of the myths that are already built in. So things like that are what I love the most about working on these poems, because I really do feel like you say, if you invite, or sometimes for me, I don't feel like it's as much I'm inviting the characters in with me as much as I'm asking if I can sit at the table with them. And so I find that when I ask that, and the answer sort of seems to be yes, there's so much richness there, and it's all there. And then I create narratives around it, but the richness of the material and the conversations that are sort of always in the air seem very nourishing.
Yeah. And Atlas, he's defeated, right? He's one of the Titans, so he's been defeated by the Olympian gods, and he's carrying this the sky.
And if you're carrying the sky, you can't carry your daughter, for example. You can't pick up your daughter. Things like that.
So she, Calypso, in some ways, you're sort of, well, maybe I'll make this leap. She's sort of she can make it good, as we often do. Because here's a man who's alive and with her. He's not holding up the sky, but he's got a burden as well. And so it gives her a chance, an opportunity to make their life better, I guess. Well,
I'm not even sure if I think I often don't, I try not to go to that conclusive part. I sort of imagine letting the characters still live their own decisions without deciding their fates for them. But I just think that allowing the nuance to be there, and it could mean that it could mean that she instead sort of learns that she can be around a man without being codependent and without taking on his burdens. One other thing I learned, I love the etymology of ancient Greek so deeply. I did take a year of ancient Greek language with Athena. It nearly killed me. It is the amount of ways to conjugate verbs in ancient Greek is frankly impractical.
A lot of memorizing,
A lot of memorizing.
Ha, to, to, ton, ha, all that.
Exactly. But I did learn that Calypso, the word, means to cover or conceal. And in the Odyssey, Penelope's main adjective, like how Athena is often described as shining-eyed, Penelope is often described as pakis, which means sort of thick or opaque or veiled. And so I have this line in the poem where I wrote, Calypso, to cover or conceal, your wife and I, we share a love of veils. And so just things like little sort of nerdy, delightful things.
No, those are vital, important things, you know. She's the concealer, so she conceals Odysseus, I would guess.
She conceals Odysseus, and right, it's so fun. And Penelope is very opaque as a character. I think you never really know what she's thinking, what her motivations are. I mean, on the surface, she is very clearly, the faithful wife who is sort of pining away, rejecting the suitors. But then there is this concealing and this unknowingness, and the fact that her main act is weaving and unweaving the shroud.
Yeah,
I love so deeply. And I mentioned earlier I was having coffee with a conductor yesterday who's studying Scheherazade and Penelope for a program, and he made the point, which I never thought of, that both for Scheherazade and Penelope, when they finish their creative work, they cease postponing the future and they have the future that they want. Which for Scheherazade is a little, I don't know if having a psychopath fall in love with you is quite a happy
Well, he's
ending.
reformed by
He's
the
a
end.
reformed
But yeah.
We all know how that goes.
Right.
And I love that idea too, this sort of presence always of the creative, tangible arts in the Odyssey for the women, and the weaving and the singing, and even the bathing of the men is sort of an act of tenderness.
Yeah.
I just really love how alive and tangible that work feels.
Right. The bathing's always on the edge for me as a storyteller, because you want to present the story in a way people can connect with, and I want to do all the, as you called it, nerdy work, and go in there. But in some ways, if I am somehow able to give the whole richness of the world, it'll start to seem really alien to people.
Right.
And the bathing is kind of on the line for me because it happens so often.
So often.
It's amazing,
I know. And it is sort of alien. It does not, the equivalent doesn't exist in our culture with adults, I think, certainly with, children or older people. But
the Puritan Americans would be a little bit like, wait, they don't even know each other, and she's like bathing a naked
just
guy,
wasting all this olive oil on
I know. What's going on? Telemachus gets bathed, right? Whenever they travel, it's quite, but it's sort of ritually, it has some significance.
Right, absolutely.
Interesting. And Calypso, what's she doing on that island? Like, why is she there?
Well, right, I think she's there because she, I believe, was banished there.
Yeah,
I believe, but I don't remember the details of her banishment. I guess I got interested in her from the time of her sort of abiding on that island. But so anyway, that was a very long tangent because I just think about these characters so much. But Calypso and Cersei and Penelope were probably the main three that really drew me in. But then I also got so fascinated with not just Odyssey. They're all mentioned in the Odyssey, but the other main cast of characters like Demeter, Persephone. I wrote some men were invited in as well, which it's not at all. There's no like black and white. I don't want the male perspective. I love the openness of the female perspective. But Orpheus is in there. Icarus is in there. The Dawn is a character that I love, and I wrote a poem imagining the Dawn taking Persephone as her lover, and this idea of sort of the day and the night, spending the night together. And the Dawn in the Odyssey is always described as having rosy-colored fingers. Yeah. And so I imagined, and if anyone steals this for a poem, the Dawn will destroy you.
Look out.
Look out, she'll blind you. But I wrote about the two of them. I imagine them sharing a pomegranate and the pomegranate staining her fingers. So when she gets up from this sort of night tumbled bed with Persephone and she pulls the sun out of hiding, she has rose-colored fingers and they turn the sun this sort of marigold orange.
Oh,
so
that's nice. Yeah.
Just things like that I feel like they come from me, but I also feel like they don't necessarily. And we're both musicians, and I often imagine the feeling of a stringed instrument like a cello, which the cello is probably my favorite instrument, second to the piano, or tied with even, but I don't know how to play it. But I love this idea of what it means to to be a resonant body and then to be played, and that idea of maybe how stories are also this sort of resonant body of space, and the storyteller is the bow across the strings. So I just love all those things.
Right. You should tell some of these stories. Well, it sounds like you do.
Thank you.
In your own way.
That's what I'm trying to do in this book.
Yeah. Through
Yes.
poetry, you can climb into the characters
Absolutely.
in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And then, I mean, gender, right? We think of it as fluid, especially these days. But nevertheless, like as a male-identified person connecting with this story, I'm struck by how often Odysseus weeps, for example.
Yes.
And then he gets all these different relationships with women throughout, Circe, Calypso, that are all different in character. And it's almost like he's being schooled for his eventual reunion with Penelope.
Right, he's working through all
He's
his
working through it all,
all his patterns with different women.
Right. And even the monsters, like that, there's that
Oh yeah.
triumvirate, like the Sirens, Scylla, and
Right.
Charybdis, all female.
And then in Nausicaa, the sort of young, innocent
Yes.
laundry scene, which is, yeah, I agree. They're all different sides of Odysseus and different sides of relationships with the feminine, I think.
Right. It's almost like, regardless of whatever gender you are, when you first grow up, you need some practice, like figuring out what
Right.
people are,
Right,
And so
exactly.
you, hopefully date different people, for
Right,
example.
right.
This is
Yeah.
like ancient Greek dating advice. So, and what about Circe? Like, she's on the island. Why did
Yeah.
she turn the sailors into pigs? What do you think?
Well,
Because she could kill them, probably, you would think. She's quite
right.
powerful.
So I love the Circe story. I love thinking of Cersei and Odysseus as sort of more of a partnership, I think, because they also spent many years together, and they're in the book. I mean, the book Cersei probably colored my imaginings of this, but that to me seems like more of a sort of true collaborative partnership than the sort of idyllic love nest of Calypso or whatever that is. But so one interpretation I've read of the pigs, which I kind of like thinking about, is that she could have, just because she's an herbalist, she could have given them something like a hallucinogen, and they could have had a really terrible trip and sort of envisioned themselves as pigs, and so I kind of like that idea. But I also like this idea, which I think, again, I was wrestling with a lot, this idea of how much I wished that those who cause harm would have to look themselves fully in the face. And I think that idea of someone just being shown who they are is what I think of when I think of why she transforms them into pigs. I think all she did in the most interesting reading for me is she just showed them exactly who they were.
Oh, yeah.
And that is what caused them to have a complete breakdown.
Right.
And then I found it interesting that when Odysseus asks her to change them back, I sort of imagine like the male gaze being dropped into place again, and that saves them from seeing themselves, and they feel normal again.
The male gaze being dropped into place. You mean like...
Well, sort of, so Odysseus kind of shows up. She says, okay, I will give you the exception. I will take you as my lover and partner. And but when he shows back, it's like the order of Odysseus, everything he means sort of returns to the scene. And so I think he needs these men to believe that they are capable, able men, not having a mental breakdown because they're horrible. But if I think about it in sort of taking the story at its word, literally turning them into pigs, I don't know. I also sort of think there's something more satisfying for her, I would imagine, about turning them into creatures that are sort of just helplessly stumbling around and terrified, but also just like deeply useless. And I'm sure she was like, God, you are just useless. Like you show up at my island, I offer you hospitality, you try to sexually assault me. Like killing you, I would have to clean everything up. I'd have to, have more blood on my hands. I'm just gonna like make you as useless as possible and set you aside. So
yeah.
I sort of I understand that as well.
Right. I'm setting you aside
That's
right
right,
now.
yep.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you understand that well. All right. Yeah, that's right.
I mean,
That's like,
no pigs or men have been harmed.
yes. Well, it feels right to have them be pigs, you know.
I agree.
If they were birds, that would be something different.
That would
you
be
know?
a whole different feeling.
Yeah.
Yes,
They're
I
connected
agree.
with the earth, and pigs. I mean, whether we think of them, I think of them anyway, as like without restraint in a way. They'll eat anything, like a paper plate, you know, just throw it down, right?
That's a good point. They're indiscriminate consumers.
Yes,
Yeah.
and certainly Odysseus and his sailors have been that. I mean, they when he sacked the city early on in the Odyssey,
Right.
and then of course in the Cyclops cave, you know, where
Right.
we're just going to eat
That's
this
true.
stuff because
Yeah.
it's here, you know, right?
That's true.
So I like what you said about teaching them, because if she's not going to kill them, what does she get out of them? What does she
Right.
want?
Right.
And so it's sort of like, I'm going to show you who you really are. And that's
Right.
sort of sometimes a punishment, and sometimes it's a
Right.
gift, right, I guess, to see who we really are.
Right.
You know? Wow, interesting. Cersei and her pigs. Yeah.
And
cool.
then also I think Athena, speaking of gender fluid, I think Athena is a really interesting depiction in the Odyssey because she is both, I think, deeply in love with Odysseus and deeply annoyed by him. And he sort of, I don't think he reveres her, but he respects her and sort of treats her as an equal so much. And I actually, in my book, I was having a really hard time writing about Athena because she seems and is very impervious. And so I sort of would feel like when I would try to sort of ask the character what the deal, she'd be like, figure it out.
Yeah,
and I
right,
was like,
right.
okay. So I ended up finally writing this poem and had so much fun when it finally came up, imagining her as a sort of dominatrix type character in a very roundabout way. But this idea of Odysseus always having all this power and responsibility and sort of wanting to be able to look to someone else who had equal amounts of power and responsibility and sort of harshness in a way.
Yeah.
And so I just, I loved finding a way to write about her that was both sort of tongue-in-cheek and also, you know, she's a scary lady, and she has, there's a lot of, I wrote a poem about Cassandra, because there is this terrible myth of Cassandra being raped in a temple, and Athena turning her gaze away when Cassandra asks her for help, and then, you know, cursing her. And I just think that is also such an interesting and painful but very contemporary issue or question as well. Like, what happens when women witness other women in danger or in abusive situations and they don't know how to hold it or how to see it, and so they sort of do the exact opposite, which is like absolutely put up every defense possible and blame the victims in the sort of most archaic victim blaming narrative. So she's a complicated character, and I think it doesn't do her justice to sort of just have her be one-dimensional, because I don't think she is.
Yeah. It's great. I mean, we look at this thing from our modern viewpoint, right? And it's really interesting, the things that sort of stop us.
Yeah.
Certainly with audiences, Odysseus weeping and falling asleep. Some people, not everybody, but some people are like, he's supposed to be the big hero. Why is he so sad all the time? And then Athena, in a similar way, like in many ways, we're all about the powerful goddess, yes,
Right,
but then she's a little bit, as you said, impermeable, and she's sort of almost a war goddess in a way. I mean, she's very aggressive.
Right.
you
She's
know?
also very petty, like all the
Yeah.
gods. She's sort of like, well, I don't like this, so I'm gonna.
Right. Yeah, interesting. And she's absent from the story for a while too. She kind of splits, you know, and it seems. And then at the end, she's totally there with every little thing. I mean, do the human characters have even their own choices to make in these stories? What do you think?
Absolutely they do. I think so. I think that I think they do, and I like that the gods are fallible too, because I think that makes for a very different, I would imagine, it makes for a very different existence as a human if you have a religious structure that includes fallible gods. That's a whole, and living gods who are like actively trying to sleep with your wife or trying to murder your cattle or whatever.
Yeah.
That's very different than this sort of contemporary religion that often lives only in narrative alone, or many different forms. But I think that probably would remind the humans more often than not that they do have free will, and that the gods are very much exerting their own will, and it's sort of interchangeably bouncing off the free will of the humans. So I think they absolutely do. I mean, I think the consequences of disobeying the gods might be a little more apparent and immediate than someone in our current society who might think of gods in some way. But yeah, I think I think often about Telemachus and his decision to have the maids hung instead of stabbed, and of course that is sort of interesting from a Freudian perspective of the idea of, is Telemachus a virgin? Does it have something to do with the stabbing as a sexual thing or not? But this idea that he chooses to think that he is sort of doing the merciful thing by hanging them instead of stabbing them to death, but then it's also very much a huge act of cowardice, and of course he's still slaughtering these innocent women who were, very likely sexually abused by the soldiers for the whole duration of Odysseus's absence. So there's just, I think there are a lot of choices that are made by every character that are both beautiful and generous, and also sort of small and mean and cowardly, and they're just, I think they're all very human. Even the gods are very human.
Yeah, it's so refreshing in that way. It's not like this fake artificial world. It's a world that seems very connected to our own.
And the morals are interesting, because I mean, what do you think of the sort of moral what do you think the moral compass even is in these stories? It seems like hospitality is such a huge part of the it really does seem almost like a moral value. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think are sort of the guiding motivating factors in these characters and in this landscape.
Well, it depends on the character, I think, too. But yes, I think hospitality runs throughout the story as like something, and Odysseus and his sailors violate that, with the Cyclops, with many other things. And so that's a big value. There's definitely a warrior moral code in certain characters, right? You gotta fight, and it's better to die on your feet than to die in your bed, kind of thing, which can be a little repugnant to us now. But what I like is it's larger than the human morals as well. And like I've keep saying, but I mean, Odysseus' failures, in this story. I mean, the Iliad is very as you know, right? It's warrior all the time. I mean, there's a lot of sorrow in it, which is cool, more than I at first thought. But the Odyssey is, I don't know, it's a world where he moves forward by failure often, which is more like real life, So, yeah, there are moral values the characters have, and they believe in certain things. A big one that I think we don't value the home as much as they did.
Yeah.
Oikos, the household, right? And I see that in two things. I see it in it's halfway through when he gets to Ithaca, right? It's 24 books long, and it's book 13 when he gets to Ithaca. And when we summarize the story, as I just did earlier, for example, you focus on the monsters, right? And all that. But half of the story is just creeping inch by inch back into his own house.
I agree. I have the poem I wrote about Penelope, because she has, towards the end of the Odyssey, I believe, she has this very strange dream about geese. Yes. I don't know if you remember this. And so the poem is called Penelope Dreams of Geese. And the first stanza is, "The geese are a dove-gray flock of 20 years of honking oikos, oikos, oikos." Oh, yeah. Because they sort of sound like that, right?
Right,
and they're sort of like these, I just was imagining these years sort of screeching, calling Odysseus back. Yeah. But yeah, I agree. The home is it's like a person in the story.
And maybe for the listeners, just if you didn't catch that, oikos is a Greek word meaning household, home, and the word economics comes from, is related to that. Also Penelope, I find, like you, I want to know more about her story, for sure. But at the same time, I feel like we are in a culture which values action among women and men. We she stood up for herself, she did it, and I'm not judging that, but I think we come to the Odyssey with that value judgment. And so to have a female character that was determined to hold the house together and stay at home, I guess, I mean, maybe she didn't, but we can't connect with that value for the most part as a culture. We're like weaving stuff, baking bread, cleaning a house. That's all ridiculous. We want, it used to be like women should do that and men should go conquer the world.
Right.
Now it's sort of like, well, nobody should do that.
That's
and
so
we're going to get
interesting.
AI to do it, or we're just
Right.
not even going to have a dining room, because who needs a dining room? We're all got two jobs.
Maybe that's also partly why I love this world so much, because those are, I mean, not cleaning the house. I don't have any desire to build my life around that, but the act of sort of creating and bringing people, like the act of gathering and celebration and sort of feeding people, hosting people, just music, all the things that were done in the home, I think are very much at the core of all the things I build my life around. So for me, Penelope's work, in a way, I'm like, she's the only one getting things done in this book.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I should say for our listeners, we were talking earlier about baking, and I bake bread regularly, but Bethany, she's a level beyond me.
Oh,
she
well,
baked
thank
5 cakes today, she said. So I'm just saying that. I don't think that's every day that happens, but
Thank you.
Sorry to out you as a baker.
No, it's fine. I do, I resonate a little bit with Cersei in terms of the herbal witchery. I really, one of the cakes I made this morning, for example, was a hazelnut brown butter cake with an apricot, peach, and cardamom leaf jam.
Wow.
And then I made a smoked honey, chamomile, and thyme buttercream. So
Wow.
I'm very much, I don't know, it feels like co-creating with the ingredients. And
Yeah. My tongue's imagination isn't big enough to hold all those words you just
I
threw
think
at me.
most people would fall asleep halfway through the flavor list.
Yeah,
but
that's
if you
pretty
taste
amazing.
it,
Wow.
hopefully it comes together.
Yeah. Well, it just seems like the question is, what is life about? And one answer is it's about killing the dragons.
Right.
Journeying across the sea, talking to the dead. But the other half of the answer, and I think the Odyssey makes this clear, is home. And hospitality and having a home to come home to and be
Right.
happy and to have a feast and to sing the songs and eat the amazing cake.
I agree. And I wish I could remember who wrote this. It was a beautiful essay I read about, oh my goodness, I wish I could remember the author, but an essay I read recently about the difference between men and women in ancient stories and the way that they're often depicted by objects. And it was talking about this idea of men, often having weapons and spears and swords and things that are sort of very direct and purposeful, and then women often having vessels, so to carry water, to carry clothing. And I love that idea of thinking of the characters in this story too in that way, although I think Odysseus holds many, many things, but like you were saying, this sort of division of purpose in terms of, are you going out and slaying the dragons? Are you going off into war? Or are you sort of holding the domestic sphere? Are you also a vessel for all the things that are not going out and killing or conquering?
Yeah. That's fascinating to think about. I mean, a spear, how many things can you do with a spear, right? Whereas like a pot, I would, just without thinking about it too deeply, just off the top of my head, a pot, you can do a lot. You
Exactly,
can
right.
soup, you can have a fire in there,
Right.
you could, it could be a hat. I mean, I don't know.
Or a baby could take a nap in there.
A baby can take a nap in it, yeah. Where a spear is sort of a tool designed for a specific
Exactly.
job, very specific.
So I will try to find that essay and send it to you. It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I want to say
that's
it's
cool.
Ursula K. Le Guin, but I could be wrong.
Cool. And just another question: the sort of the take on the divine in this story, is that anything like your own experience of the divine in any way, either now or when you were growing up?
Well, I think for me, present day, the divine is really inseparable from everything I love, which is the natural world and the act of creation. I think is very much in constant fellowship with what I understand to be the divine, and I don't really think that I think of it as something separate from that. It's like I access my relationship with the divine by being around flowers or by having my hands in butter and sugar, or by being at the piano. I mean, I think everywhere I try, and again, I said this earlier, often, sometimes I'm exhausted and I don't show up in full creative capacity. But when I show up at the piano or at the bakery or at the page, or with people I love, I think I try to think of all those things as altars and sort of try to be fully present there and sort of grateful for the ability to be there. And I think for a long time, I didn't have the ability to do that because when I was much younger, had been in a pretty severely abusive relationship with a creative mentor. I think for a long time, I sort of was wrestling with recovering from that, and also this fear of whether or not I would inherit my parents' grief and depression and anxiety. Knock on wood, I got my maternal grandmother's resilient spirit. But I think all that is to say, I'm very aware now of how much I believe that joy really is an act of resistance, and I feel like it is my life's work to remember to sort of be constantly like a vessel for joy, which sounds maybe a little bit ridiculous in its vastness, but I don't mean it that way. I just really think, having discovered that I have the capacity to feel that much joy and to find it in creativity, that's what I want to spend my life doing.
Lovely. Bethany, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Jay.
And your book, you have a book that's looking around for a publisher.
Yes, publishers, come find me.
Come find you. Yes. And do you have a website or no?
Not for my poetry, but you can find my bakery it's called Pies and Pinups, like 1940s pinup girls, piesandpinups.com. Okay. I'm also on the normal social media platforms, but if you find me there and you're curious about poetry, I can certainly send some your way.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
And thank you to The Story for being with us.
Yes, thank you to The Story. And may we continue to live within and around and inside those stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.